Well, Dylan and I had the pleasure of visiting with a client yesterday. His name is John in Southwest Wisconsin. And John was a previous client. And so he originally started with 30 acres, had me develop a plan 2 years ago. And then now he was able to buy the 40 next to him, which gave him a cabin, gave him a lot more family use. And so I'm really excited for him. But what an enhancement in his whitetail opportunity. And part of that is the family use and the family fun. But with more food, more cover, and better access, he now has the pieces in place that, to me, create a really big buck parcel. I've gone in the past, I've talked about that ideal range of being 40 to 70 acres, or to 120 acres, where you have the true potential of tapping into every buck in the area. And what's nice about the additional 40, the 30 was pretty good, but the 40 gives him more access, and we'll talk about that because of the public land that's next to him and his ability to go through the public land and come into his land. And I think that's perfect. So we got to see John again. We got to spend the time with him, and Dylan was along to film it all. And Dylan's going to his own clients, so it was cool to have Dylan there and give his input a little bit. And he's worked enough with me that he thinks of things sometimes I might not. And so it's pretty cool to have Dylan and I out there and again spend the day with John. And really we'll just dive right into it. The first thing, and this is something that you guys out there have to consider all the time when you're designing your own land and whitetail parcel, is family use. I've had dirt bike tracks, horseback riding, hiking trails, snowshoe, cross-country skiing, and even just family walks where you want to take family through the property and expose the family to hunting and deer within the property. So that has to be managed, and we plan the improvements around here. Now what you look at, these stand locations are white with access, numbered, red lines for deer travel corridors. And I apologize if this looks a little messy, but I draw these plans up at the end of the day with the client, and that is critical. I've heard of some whitetail consultants sending a plan to a client 6 months later, 3 months later, and there's a complete disconnect. So I want to design the property right then, and I want to talk to, it's no clear in my mind 3 weeks from now, and if I have to think that hard about it, I probably shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. It should be very clear what's going on the property, the design that should be there, how the land should be hunted in that 1 day time frame. And we talk to the clients in the beginning at breakfast time, coffee time, meeting time in the morning. We head to the property, and then after we're on the property, we talk about the improvements. And so in this case, it was awesome with John because he probably had 5 pages of notes before we even left the property, maybe 6 pages. I love that. It's not that you have to take notes out in the field, but people are taking notes, are engaged, and they're learning, and they're reinforcing that learning, and they'll be able to apply that to their land at a lot higher level and ultimately find a lot higher level of success. So that's what we did. I drew this plan up with John at the end of the day, which is how I do it every single time. In fact, if a client says, I'm not going to be around for you to draw it up, just send it to me. We will not take you on as a client. We want you to be engaged. We want you to be here for this. It takes extra time. It's extra discussion. But if someone's not engaged enough to be there at the end for the discussion and drawing time, then we'd rather just work with someone else, because we turn a lot of clients away. And I'd rather work with someone that's going to really work hard and be successful and being fully engaged. Family time and the mixed use, like you guys might have, I do, and John certainly does. If you can see this dark road coming in here, the black, that's a road coming in. In this area is that family zone area. Cabin is right in the middle. This is all open timber. I don't want to make improvements in that area. Want the family to be able to enjoy. They have a zip line that goes from about right here to right there. Pretty cool setup for the kids. Camping use, couples weekend, ladies wine weekend, wherever it might be. But there's a lot of activity taking place in this area right here. So very important that we consider that in the plan. And as you can see, the improvements are made from border to border all the way around this plan, like a big oblong U. We want the deer to relate to this entire area. So this is getting kind of messy. We'll jump on to the next point, but important to consider family use. The last thing you want to do is, for example, there's big open fields right up here. Pretty good sized fields that are already open. where if you planted food plots there, you're putting deer across the street in the valley on someone else's land. You're holding deer more potentially up in the public land that is this way right here. This is public right here, and then also public on this side right here. So really, just because it's the easiest place to plant a food plot doesn't mean it's the best, and this is certainly the case. And that extends to right down here. We have in that valley below the cabin, we have a big open field area in this spot right here, and it's open right now. There's a mix of food plots. Every deer that's in there can look back at the cabin, and so we created a long narrow plot that goes through the middle. It's putting deer into heavy cover right here. This is all open public land cover, and so we're training the deer. You know, the worst thing you could do is have a food plot that just extends right into the public land or right under the edge, throwing deer on and off that public land. So we're paralleling the property line, pushing deer into a very thick cover that relates to this front cover right here. So lots of things we're doing to consider where people can see, people can watch, and the last thing we want to do is create a food plot or habitat improvement that invites deer to people use and human use in general. Now the next point that I have up here is food versus cover. With that, I want to make sure that I'm putting food in the appropriate places so that it can actually complement the land and the hunt and how people are using it. For example, this food source right here is high up on top. It's a very big food source. We want John to get to that size of at least 2 acres. And then that complements all of the bedding opportunity and cover that is extending completely down the hill over 200 feet in elevation down to the road in this area right here. We don't want the deer staying in here, so we're not improving the cover in this location. Again, this is that people area. It's completely surrounding that cabin. We don't want deer in that inside face so that people are seen in everything they do here, kids playing around. And so what we're doing is we're developing this core area going all the way down the hill in a pretty large area. And if you think about it, this line, if you drew it right down here, that's 30 acres to the west on this left side, and then 40 acres to the east. So again, we're creating that cover that extends all the way down to the bottom, and that's that depth of cover. Now, John only has a couple hundred yards before that border in that triangle shaped 30, but this is also complemented by the fact that this cover extends all the way across the back into the hollow, and then all the way up here, and that's all up high. We're 200 feet in elevation up. So great depth when you add in the elevation. He also has pretty good timber, junk timber. There's not a lot of higher timber values. So I'm looking at this orange area right here that complements this food source, and this one right here, and this line down here. Also a little bit of cover up here where we're looking at this little rim. There's always some red cedars in there. So I'm looking at those orange areas. Those are where you're taking down a mature tree every 30, 40 yards. You're not making too much of a mess where you're dropping tree upon tree. If you do, you can clean it up a little bit so the deer can still utilize that area. But you're bringing a substantial amount of sunlight to the ground, and then that's not it. John has good 6 to 8 inch trees that he can actually hinge cut to the larger trunks or tops and get that really clear horizontal cover that not only provides cover at deer level, waist-high cuttings, but also provides more food as those trees sprout and those hinge cuts sprout all the way along the log that's cut down. So that's a heavier form of cutting. You see how this, we want the deer to relate to this side of the food, not John's axis on this side or up here. So that's why those are in those locations. And also, we want deer to relate to this edge. It's a really nice bench system all the way along the bottom. And by cutting that, this is all open field on this side. And so it's allowing sunlight in the afternoon to come directly into this area, and that's actually thickening this edge up quite a bit up in here. So really working on those layers of cuttings, and some heavier than others to dictate where deer are actually bedded on the land. This golden color right here, and that's extended all the way around the property. That's that general timber stand improvement. That's where you're taking those mature trees every 30 to 40 yards. In the case of junk oak, maple, there's some dying ash out there that could be cut down, some junk cherry, and most of the timber value was taken before John purchased it. So there's a lot of big tops that you can get down in the ground, get sunlight into those areas. And by the time you create those holes, you're getting sunlight in from all different locations. And the cool thing about that is once you get those down, it's not a lot of trees to cut per acre. But you can do this again in 4 or 5 years, 3 years, 8 years. You can use the resources of the timber that's already there, junk timber, cutting it down, getting more sunlight in. So when you see that it's starting to open up a little bit, you cut some more trees down in the same matter. And it's something that can be managed for decades to come in a way to always keep those areas in good holding cover. This area right here, as far as cover goes, I'd love to see this entire area be open, mature, giant, beautiful timber, because that's what I want the family to walk through, blow their scent into, and to be able to access through to get to actually quality stands that relate to heavier covers. So it's good to have that dead area. And if you look at this, we'll just talk about this real quick as it relates to food and cover. I talk about an efficiency of a parcel. Efficiency of a parcel is that area that you can actually say this is all deer all the time. If you look at this, we're taking out this chunk in the middle right here for access. We're taking along the road here. So that area in particular, I would say that represents 15 to 20% of the land. There's areas along this line where we're creating a heavier level of improvement. You can see a deer travel corridor in red. We're making a 2 to 3 foot mountain bike type path where it's easy for us to walk on. It's easy for deer to walk on. You could ride a mountain bike on it. And then in those areas, we're dropping timber 30 to 40 yards, mature timber, to get sunlight in there. And then we're completing hinge cut. You never want to complete hinge cuts first and then drop the large timber later after you realize that the sunlight's not hitting the hinge cuts and they're not growing, they're not viable. It's a waste of resource. So you always want to cut big timber down first. I've been on many properties already this year, again, where people have paid for hinge cutting and paid for cuttings where they're cutting and they're not getting sunlight to those cuttings. So the cuttings die and it was a complete waste of money, resource, and time. This area right here represents that open area of no deer improvements. You can see there's areas like this where we have an edge that's not being improved to get into and out of stand locations. An area right here, we're not improving the habitat because we want to be able to get in and out of stand locations. And the same could be said for this rim right around here with mature timber up against the public land so that we can actually say that these areas aren't supposed to sport deer because we don't want them transferring on and off the public land. We want the deer to feel safe when they get onto the property, but we don't want them to be encouraged to live on the public land because of our improvements where people can actually hunt in those locations. When you add it all up, the parcel efficiency on this 70 acres, by the time you add switchgrass screening in these fields out here to make the deer feel more secure from the road and from the access, to really more insulate the property just like this giant hillside does right here, then I would look at that and say there's at least 65 to 70% of the land that is all deer all the time, and that's at efficiency level. As the property gets smaller, 30 acre parcel, 20 acre parcel, it's impossible to put 65% of that land into all deer all the time unless you have roads going around the whole parcel and you really don't have to transfer your sight, sound, or scent into that area. That's that core area. The core area on this parcel would be everything around that I haven't circled, but that core area is between these tree stands on this side. Note that the food plots are in that core area. It's within this portion right here, all the way around, and a little bit up here. And what you're left with is that smaller percentage. It's also up here. That core area, it's very critical to include the food plots. What's a sanctuary? Who knows? A lot of people say I have 10-acre sanctuary over here, and I never go in there. The deer are safe, but they walk by it. The deer can hear them in there, and the deer can see them out of there. So that's not a sanctuary. A true sanctuary is that core area that represents over 50% of your land that's all deer all the time, where you can do your best to not allow the deer to see you, hear you, or smell you in those locations. And at this point, once John completes his improvements and adds those food plots into his sanctuary areas, he'll have an area that's about 65% of his land That's the efficiency level that he can devote to all deer all the time. Something that John is very fortunate with is that he can come off public land in this direction to hit a stand, this direction to hit 2 stands. He has a stand up here that we didn't mark, but he can actually come through the public land, down the road, come back into it, and get into the land like that. So really good access based on the use of the public land, getting into those locations. I encourage him not to leave flags, markers, anything on the public land. You don't want an invitation for people to come onto his property, but to watch the GPS and walk in, watch his phone, aerial photo, and get in and out. Something that we'll talk about more in the coming weeks, but I expect these plots, the big ag over here to the west, there's ag to the south, and I expect these plots on John's land, these larger ones right here, that's about 2 acres altogether. This is about 2 acres right here. I expect those plots to represent what I call holding plots. Completely different than a destination plot. A destination plot is overused, overabused. There's a lot of diversity in a destination plot. People are doing their best to provide a lot of food. But what I find are a lot of diversity plots become nighttime parcels because people overhunt them, nighttime food plots, where deer do not feel safe going into those large plots until after dark. And that means they're on someone else's land typically. So they're waiting until after dark coming onto the property. People rarely see daylight bucks. And this is the opposite of what I want for John. I want these plots to be holding plots. What that means is that these deer come out of John's cover, whether they're bed on the hillside coming up, or they bed on a steep hillside going down to these plots. They freely move through cover that connects these plots and bedding areas back and forth. I want deer to move from and around John's property to these afternoon holding plots. The plots are designed to be safe and hold those deer until dark and then release them to the neighbor's ag lands. Could be that you're releasing them to the neighbor's food plots after dark, bait piles in some areas, maybe a clear cut that's on the neighbors. But what you're doing is giving them that diversity that they want adjacent to their bedding areas. You're holding the deer until dark. They visit those plots about an hour before dark every single day, especially those doe family groups, those core doe family groups that are there all the time. They hit those plots and then they leave after dark. And those are what represent true holding plots. And you'll notice that on this plan, I have just a couple. Here's a little hunting plot right here. You notice there's no cover, no improvements on this side. And that's so that someone sitting here in the afternoon, evening, especially when it relates to the kids. John's daughter shot her first deer last year out of that stand, a doe. And you're letting that scent in the evening, because there's no wind back in this hollow virtually. So with that food plot in that downwind area, it means you can hunt this in the evening with light winds. Really hard to even get it wind in here with all the swirling wind and the blockages of the ridges around. But that last 3 hours of daylight, you could sit in there with no wind, and the closer it gets to dark, the more that scent is going to blow right back to the cabin down the draw. You can't see the food plot from the cabin. It's hidden around the corner. And so a very good hunting plot. I love little areas like this system right here, or 8 with a water hole. You can allow those deer to come out of here in the evening, hit the water, hit this food, and then they go right back across the road to the neighbor's ag field. The end of this plot right here represents a really nice little hidden corner of the food plot where you can get in and out without spooking deer. And that's it. I'd hunt on food right here, here, here. You get up to the side of it right here. It's a very steep bank coming in here. John has a bulldozer trail cut in there that we recommended. Let the scent blow off and you'll be good. Let it blow down to the cabin in the evening. Blow off the hillside in the morning. Never spook deer. And so you're really limiting your hunting on the food plots. You recognize the difference between a holding and a hunting plot. There's a big difference. Hunting plot is just a pass through on the way to a holding plot. Pass through on the way to a neighbor's food source, and you're holding those deer in those locations and then sending them off your property. And that's what we'll do with John's here. Now we have the family use, food versus cover. Now that he has actual true core bedding area, food sources, and again, bedding area in these locations. So you have bedding and obviously the food in green. But that allows John to hold deer within that bedding area, send them to food sources, that holding cover in the afternoon or holding food plots in the afternoon. And what's great about that is then when you start looking at some of these stands around here, and we go over this with the client a lot of times, is number 2 and number 3 up here, high in this ridge that you go all the way through public land to get to, those become morning stands. Number 6 here, where you're sneaking in potentially next to bedding area, becomes a morning stand. I like number 7 here for a morning stand, because if you get in there in the afternoon, there's a likelihood you could be pushing deer that are bedded near there. It's thick. But I like the idea of getting into a spot like that in the morning because it's well away from food. Number 8 turns into morning or evening. Number 9, morning or evening. So you're looking at number 1, morning stand, and then you have these stands out here, number 12, 11, 10 could be morning or evening in that situation. But you look at these stands, 4 is evening, 5 could be either, but you're looking at stands because you have defined food sources and defined bedding areas. A lot of this based on elevation change, then you can actually have that a stand assemblage where you can say this is a morning stand because of this is an evening stand because of this. Typically morning because of bedding, evening because of food sources and that afternoon food source movement. So you can have that stand assemblage. And that's what we built for John on this property, so that he actually can take the guesswork out and look at it and say, I know if I go to this stand, I told him, wait for 2 and 3 right up there. Those 2 stands up there just alone, to me, are stands you could shoot a mature buck on every single year. I called this a 70-acre Wisconsin big buck parcel. There's big, unique bucks in the area. We found some sheds yesterday, a matching set, and just the characteristics of the antlers, you can tell. They have a lot of odd points, lots of non-typical characteristics, and it's a special area of southwest Wisconsin. There's a lot of big buck areas in southwest Wisconsin, but this is a pretty cool one. So that stand assemblage comes because of we're considering the access for the family, the overall food versus cover use, then that tree stand assemblage comes. And then we're enhancing those movements with water holes and mock scrapes. Because of his elevation change, normally I wouldn't recommend 5 water holes on 70 acres, but because he has 200 to 300 foot changes in elevation and he has high areas that deer might not be into from the low areas that they come from or vice versa, then you're able to use a lot of water holes. So I like the water holes. I like them back, especially in these morning stand locations where you're looking for actual buck cruising areas. Really cool setup for the family to use this little hunting plot, get in and out. It's the yellow is switchgrass, so these food plots are all flanked with switchgrass. Switchgrass out front to again insulate the parcel. And then mock scrapes at every stand location. I encourage mock scrapes at every stand location. No scent drippers, no fancy frills or anything, because that actually diminishes the value of the scrape. And you want 1 scrape on average per stand location. You don't want scrapes located in areas where you're drawing deer away from stand locations potentially. And you don't want too many water holes or mock scrapes, because then that devalues the addition of every one that you add, because it's oversaturating the number of scrapes and water holes that you have. So once this is all assembled, then we can enhance the stand locations. And then finally, switchgrass screening. Switchgrass screening we're using for everything out here. That's going to insulate the family use and all the traffic that comes with it, whether they're camping, ladies' wine weekend, and then certainly the access in and out, the zip line, everything else the kids want to do around there. The switchgrass can insulate that. So you can see right up here, even just a 6-foot edge around that food plot is all it takes. I have a lot of 6-foot screening of switchgrass, and it's very thick, you can't see through it. We don't need the height up there for screening, so we don't need miscanthus grass or something like that, because it takes too long to grow and it's too expensive and time consuming to plant in this case right here. Now if John had power lines out here and you needed that screening under the power lines, then miscanthus grass would be really appropriate for that area, because he needs a height, but it's under a power line. And if they need the height, then miscanthus grass would be great. Otherwise, switchgrass is perfect. It only takes a couple years to establish. It's a perennial, lasts for decades if managed well. and it's not too hard to manage either. So switchgrass is an important part of this. If you notice, a lot of these areas, number 11, we're not expecting any deer out in that solid switchgrass along the food plot, because if those deer in that switchgrass, they have no browse, so they don't enjoy bedding out in that switchgrass. That allows John to have several different access points where he might come in one way, sit in a stand, blow his scent away from that movement, and then when he gets out, he actually travels and goes through the public land and gets out of there. So he comes in one way, goes out the other, and often that's a great way to get in and out of a stand. It might be that John comes all the way up here, goes through the saddle, gets in this stand, watches it for the day, opening day of season, and then goes back out this way because he figures that deer are on one side or the other, or vice versa. So it's always good to consider other options for going in and out, and John has a few of those where you can get in one way, come out the other. And always considering where the deer are at when you're accessing, not necessarily where they're going to be while you're on stand when you access. So that was kind of some of the nuts and bolts that I hope you can take back and apply to your own land. It was a really enjoyable day. It was great seeing John again. I have a lot of repeat clients. It's a certain percentage of my clients every year. I've been to one client, Bill and client in Michigan. I believe I've been on Bill's land either 5 or 6 times. And that's been really enjoyable. Dylan, can you think of anything else when we were out there that you want to add about the property and things that we saw?
No, I just really liked the change in elevation and kind of being able to hunt several different kinds of movement. Whether the deer bedding high or traveling around, some of those elevation changes offered a lot of different opportunities.
Yeah, it's hard to. Elevation is a blessing when it comes to deer land. It pushes the age structure up, separates hunters, deer, and John. If he finishes this, and John, if you're watching, make sure you finish this plan. I feel confident that he will, but he's going to find a lot of success with this. I look forward to him putting these pieces in place and how we have it written up here, and I appreciate him having Dylan along for the day so that we can bring it to you, and ultimately, I hope that you can bring it back to your land and make yourself a better deer management manager, habitat manager, and deer hunter for this fall. Now, as we transition into habitat season, I hope you've had a chance to check out my web class, How to Design Your Whitetail Parcel. It's on my website, whitetailhabitatsolutions.com. I have a link in the description, and I hope you can find it, check it out, and enjoy it this year.